Analyst with Ejaz Zaider. Foreign Minister Shah Mahmood Qureshi arrived in Tehran earlier today after a 3-day visit to the UAE. He is also expected to go to Turkey on the morning of 23rd after the Iran leg. Qureshi's visit to UAE came 2 days after Emirati ambassador to the US, Yusuf Al-Utaiba, said Pakistani and Indian officials had traveled to Dubai for backdoor negotiations. Since Indian External Affairs Minister S. Shaikh also traveled to UAE on Sunday, there was much speculation in the Indian media about a possible meeting between the two. That was laid to rest when Qureshi issued a statement saying no such meeting was scheduled. During his visit, Qureshi discussed the entire spectrum of bilateral relations between Pakistan and the UAE, as also the regional situation, including Afghanistan. In Iran, Qureshi will be present at the opening of a new international border point between Iran and Pakistan, and establishment of 6 border markets on the zero line. Additionally, he will hold discussions on coordination on the Afghan situation and the peace process. To discuss Qureshi's UAE and Iran visits and efforts made by Pakistan to create a regional consensus on the Afghanistan peace process, I'm joined by Ambassador Najmuddin Shaikh, former Foreign Secretary, who, among other ambassadorial assignments, was also Pakistan's ambassador to Iran, and Ambassador Riffat Masood, former Pakistan ambassador to Iran and Norway. Thank you to both panelists. Let's begin with Ambassador Shaikh here. Ambassador Shaikh, let's start with the visit to the UAE, a little bit about what S. Jaishankar was doing, and give our viewers a sense of what we mean by discussing the entire spectrum of bilateral relations.
Well, I think what I understood was that the UAE is trying to play a mediatory role and has been encouraging contacts between Pakistan and India, and playing the role of providing good officers for that particular purpose. This is part of what is a new function that I think Zaid is taking upon himself, but also because it's something that's of fundamental interest to the UAE's quest for economic opportunities in South Asia. For them it is important, as it is for any investor, that they should move into an area or invest in an area only when it is relatively tension-free and there's no danger or even no danger or no prospect of something more confrontational happening in that particular area. So I think there's a degree of self-interest, and there's a degree of an expansion of the ambitions of the UAE to be able to play a constructive role in the region. So I think this is what the two visits, the visit of the Pakistani Foreign Minister and of the Indian Foreign Minister, can be termed as what is the objective while going to the UAE. In Iran, I think we've moved.
Let's get to Iran in a while. Let's first stick to the UAE. During the Trump administration, with the Yemen war, and there have been other issues also with reference to Turkey, Malaysia, and Pakistan's attempt to come together, and we know all that happened, and the UAE and Riyadh were not particularly happy. Now, with the coming in of the Biden administration, we see a difference of sorts with the Saudis also, with the UAE, with the Emiratis also. So do you see a qualitative difference now, given the fact that the Biden administration, while retaining the strategic partnership with these states, is also indicating that they are particularly concerned about some of the important issues like human rights and the rest of it?
I think that with the UAE, I don't see that as being one of the primary things that, and I'm being specific on this, I don't think they think of that in terms of the UAE. In Saudi Arabia, it is much more of a concern. In the UAE, it's a concern that emanates largely from the UAE's demands for modernization of its armed forces and the resistance to this which comes from Israel and which the American administration is bound to pay heed to. And that is why I think that the F-35 deal is now going to be in Congress for some time. Hopefully, I think from the UAE's perspective, given the advances they've made in their relationship with Israel, that this particular objection will be muted, will be reduced, and the UAE's desire to acquire these aircraft and other weaponry from the United States will go ahead.
Okay.
Now,
let's pull in. Let's pull in Ambassador Riffat Masood. Ambassador Masood, let's first stick to the UAE visit before we get to Iran, which is obviously a very, very important discussion. What is your impression of how the relations are panning out, given, as I said earlier, the tensions that there were, which also played out, which were also expressed in rather brazen manner by some of the UAE officials. So do you think that this is an attempt to sort of reset relations?
I think it's a very important relationship that we have with the UAE and the other Gulf countries. Because we've had this little bit of difficulty in the recent past, the visit of the foreign minister is, of course, very timely. And the UAE government and officials will look upon it as very important. For us in Pakistan, it's also important because, as you know, we have a large diaspora in the Gulf. And as you mentioned yourself, that the relations were a bit on the cold side in the recent past. This will, of course, give a bit of an impetus. Going back to what our senior ambassador, Najmuddin Shaikh, was saying, that the presence of the Indian foreign minister at that time was also speculative. Of course, something could be underlying. We don't know. No media reports or no official reports have come out yet. But the fact that the two ministers were there at the same time shows that the UAE is also taking on this role, which it hadn't done before, of trying to bring about some kind of a mediation or some kind of agreement or talks between Pakistan and India. And of course, when you get to Iran, the role of UAE will also be very important when it comes to not only our relations with the Middle East, the Gulf, but also the Gulf's the way they look at South Asia and with the way they look at West Asia and Iran's relationship with us. That's very important for the UAE and Saudi Arabia as well.
Okay. Ambassador Shaikh, now let's cross over the Gulf or the Persian Gulf, depending on which side of the Gulf one is and how one wants to name it, and talk about Iran. So it's very clear, the fault line between Iran and UAE/Saudi Arabia. And of course, the fact that we have traditional relations with Riyadh as well as the Gulf states and certainly also with Tehran. So give us a sense of, I mean, as I said in my opening, you were our ambassador to Iran. That was many years ago. Ambassador Masood was there a few years ago. So it'll be interesting to get your perspective and then her perspective on what is it, how do we approach Iran, what is it that we want from Iran, and what is it that Tehran expects from us?
First of all, I think we should recognize and re-emphasize the fact that the Iranians, the Abu Dhabians or the UAE, is talking to Iran. Is talking to Iran on the basis of one of the elements that they have in common is that they have this dispute with regard to the Big Tum, Little Tum, two islands that Iran is in occupation of, and which the UAE has always claimed. This is the starting point of their discussions, that this is something that we need to resolve between ourselves. And the second is that we need peace in the region, and that peace in the region can be ensured only if we have a tension-free relationship between Iran and the UAE or the GCC countries. Now, I think Foreign Minister Jawad Zarif, one of the most able diplomats of this region, or perhaps even globally, has made it clear that they are looking to and develop a relationship, and that relationship should be independent of powers that are very far away and which really have very little to do with the region's intrinsic problems or intrinsic issues. So I think that we should pay attention to the degree to which the Iranians are talking to the GCC countries, and the role that Kuwait is seeking to play in this, because Kuwait has maintained a good relationship with Iran in the past and has been, in addition to Oman, of course, Oman was the first one to play a mediatory role. They are both endeavoring to bridge the differences between the UAE and Iran, and more particularly between the UAE and Saudi Arabia. How much success will attend their efforts is difficult to say at this time, but at least there is talk going on, and it is talk that is not entirely valueless. The attitude of these countries on the JCPOA is supposed to be one of the factors that inhibits development, and which is one of the reasons why this first step, who's going to take the first step, remains an issue between Iran and the Americans. But I think that, in my view, a certain degree of tension will continue to exist between these countries, but it will not lead to anything like not just a military confrontation, but even more voluble verbal attacks on each other. I think that those are likely to be avoided for the immediate future.
So basically, talking of mediation, you talked about UAE talking to Iran. We have recent reports, not confirmed by Riyadh or by Tehran, but some of the officials have talked about it, with Iraq mediating between these officials of these two countries. So obviously there is some kind of movement there also. But give us a sense of, as I said to you in my the second part of my question, with reference to what is it that we expect from Tehran, what is it that Tehran expects from us, and of course one can safely assume that if relations between Iran and the Arab countries improve, then diplomacy for us also becomes easier.
Well, look, the first thing is to look at what the degree to which economic collaboration between Pakistan and Iran is possible, and what hopes are entertained. I mean, we've talked about the fact that the potential of trade between the two countries is $5 billion. We've talked about the fact that were certain restrictions to be lifted, we could have the Iran-Pakistan gas pipeline, and that gas pipeline, though the Indians have moved away from it now, but may be joined by India at a later point. Now these are things that lie in the future, but at the moment there is a great deal that Iran and Pakistan can do together with regard to Afghanistan. There's a great deal that they can do together in terms of cross-border trade. This opening of Mand Pishin is an important development, as is the agreement that there will be more border markets free of any duties, customs duties, etc. And the fact that we do have a payment agreement with Iran, which is sometimes active, sometimes not. We use our Asian Payment Union agreement for this purpose, and I frankly am not sure as to how well it is working now. But that is one of the things that eventually we have to look at the economic relationship between countries as being a fairly strong indicator. Though at this time, I think perhaps
absolutely
what is going
to I agree. So since Ambassador Riffat Masood was representing Pakistan only a few years ago, so let's take this to Ambassador Masood and ask her what were the challenges, what are the opportunities, what are the expectations. So over to you, Ambassador Masood.
Ambassador Najmuddin Sheikh has actually put everything into perspective. But a few things that I'd just like to add to that is that we must also not forget that while UAE and Iran are talking to each other, and there are reports of Saudi Arabia and Iran talking to each other, tensions between these countries still remain. I think we should not forget that, because though that's a reality. And that the UAE very recently recognized Israel is also something which disturbs Iran, because Iran's foremost enemy is, of course, Israel. And any country in the region, in its immediate neighborhood, which moves towards that will be disturbing for Iran. Also, not only Kuwait and Oman, but Qatar have also played a very important role. And as Ambassador Sheikh pointed out, for us, we should continue to balance our relations, because the Gulf countries are important neighbors and allies for us. Iran is an important neighbor. It's a bordering country, and we depend a lot on each other. We have to remain try to remain as neutral as possible and see the areas where we can draw convergences. And two areas are, of course, one in the economic sector, where we can improve our border trade situation, which this government happily is moving towards. We've already opened one border post, which was long-standing demand from both countries, from the people especially of both countries, Ghabd Rimdan, which happened last December, and now we're moving towards another, and 4 more posts will, inshallah, be also in the offing. Border markets will help improve the economic situation of both the regional areas, Balochistan on our side and Sistan Balochistan on Iran's side. And the second area where we can have a great deal of cooperation, and where we should actually move towards, is Afghanistan. Because for Afghanistan, as the Biden administration decides to move out by September, Iran and Pakistan can play a very pivotal role, and we should try to draw on the convergences that we have there as well. Afghanistan can become an area where we can cooperate with each other. This is what my view is. But because I feel that Iran does look towards Pakistan, I think this is a feeling I got when I was there as well, and I'm sure Ambassador Sheikh would agree with me, but that Iran would always feel that Pakistan is a neighbor, a country that it will support and rely upon when times are difficult. And it did understand that we had our own compulsions. It did understand that we had our own issues. But Iran always felt, the Iranians felt, that we should still try to not let those external compulsions impact upon our economic ties, especially with Iran. And that is why they were particularly disappointed when the gas pipeline deal did not go through. But I'm hopeful that with the current state, as we are moving towards bringing the two countries together, closer with the border markets, with border trade and economic relations, that too, the gas pipeline issue might also see some kind of daylight.
Okay, so my understanding is that initially there was some problem with the pricing, The Iranians were asking a price that we were not prepared to, we thought was, rather steep. And then, of course, the U.S. sanctions. And specifically after 2018, not just the primary sanctions, but also the secondary sanctions, which preclude not just Pakistan, but a number of countries in the world to do trade with Iran. So does Tehran understand that?
Ijaz, it's not just a question of pricing and sanctions. Of course, the sanctions are there. Everybody knows it. And there are certain restrictions. But there are countries which are carrying out trade with Iran despite those sanctions. And they have improvised mechanisms, and they have come up with innovative ideas in how to do it. I mean, India has done it, China, Russia, even other countries, the European Union as well, was thinking of bringing about a mechanism to trade. So the sanctions, of course, are there. They're a reality. They will stay there until whenever this JCPOA thing comes to some kind of life. Pricing issue is something which could be negotiated and worked out. But I think what the Iranians would always tell us is that they felt that it was more than that. It was more political and external pressures which were impeding our moves. For instance, they would say that, well, okay, we understand that you have a pricing issue, but why don't you develop the pipeline from Nawab Shah to Gwadar? Because that is part of that whole deal. And they said if you do that, then the distance between Gwadar and Chabahar is very little, and we can negotiate some kind of deal in which we can help you build that pipeline. So the fact that we were dragging our feet for whatever reasons, there were a multitude of reasons, the Iranians felt that it was much more. And it was more political pressure, and they felt that that was a little unfair, that we should not be succumbing to so much pressure. We should try to work in overcoming those external demands that are on us, and move towards this trade and economic relations. In fact, we were not even doing trade. You see, they were saying that we are ready to do bartering, but even in bartering we were slow. They're ready. They said we are ready to bring about some kind of a currency swap agreement. Ambassador Shaikh was referring to the Asian Union currency, but that hasn't really worked out because the sanctions are the last sanctions, the Trump administration sanctions, were so harsh because they were on the financial sector as such. The Iranians felt that we could find ways, but we were just not doing it because of external pressures. They were convinced of that.
Right. I mean, even the European Union, I mean, they tried to create a special utility vehicle and then Instex and all of that, but they couldn't really work it. But stay with me, Ambassador Masood. Joining me now is Ambassador Zamir Akram, former career diplomat with long experience of bilateral and multilateral diplomacy. Ambassador Akram, thank you for being on the program. We're discussing Foreign Minister Qureshi's visit to the UAE. He's reached Tehran, and on 23rd he'll be going to Turkey. So among other bilateral issues, Afghanistan is obviously on the agenda, with Pakistan trying to get some kind of consensus on the peace process. So give me your assessment of this visit to three different countries.
I think that the visits to Iran and Turkey, apart from the bilateral relations aspect, are obviously driven by the upcoming meeting in Turkey regarding Afghanistan. And fortunately, both Iran and Turkey are on the same page with Pakistan in trying to find a solution to this issue. I think the visit to the UAE was, as has been stated publicly, to talk about the so-called role or mediation by the UAE between India and Pakistan. Although there was no direct meeting between the foreign minister and his Indian counterpart. But I think sort of long-distance shuttle diplomacy is perhaps how you could describe this process that is going on with the facilitation provided by the UAE. So I think that's how I see it. It's still very early to really judge how things are going to end up at the meeting in Turkey on Afghanistan. I don't know at this stage whether the Taliban, who have said that they will not attend, will be persuaded to attend. And if they don't attend, then actually, at least in my point of view, this is going to be a non-event, because without the Taliban there is no real dialogue that can take place.
Correct. But let me just go back to what you said about the facilitation process between India and Pakistan, about which Yusuf Al-Utaba, the Emirati ambassador to the US, has talked about on the record. Do you think that while there was no direct meeting, that there's a possibility that there was some discussion, there was an indirect meeting on Sunday when S.J. Shankar flew to UAE?
I don't think that there was unless it's top secret, in which case I'm not party to it, but I don't know of any direct meeting between the Indian and Pakistani foreign minister. As I said, I think what is happening is that the UAE foreign minister is kind of playing a long-distance mediatory or shuttle diplomacy role between the two countries, and that's probably what happened. But in terms of substance, my personal view is that I don't really place much importance to this process because, one, I don't think the UAE has that kind of leverage. Certainly not on India. I mean, they may think that because we are close friends, the UAE might persuade us to do some things, but certainly the Indians are not going to be pressurized or persuaded by the UAE to do things they don't want to do. So we have to take that into consideration. It's also possible that the UAE is acting at the behest of the United States, because you mentioned the UAE ambassador in Washington, who apparently is very influential and very close to the powers that be in Washington. So he's probably also got a good chit from the Americans for doing all this. And probably that's more of a reason why that the Indians may be willing to be a part of this process, because they have an eye on Washington. But if that's a very interesting thought. That's a very interesting thought. I have also to wrap up this segment. So thank you so much. That was Ambassador Zamir. Akram, very quickly back to Ambassador Shaikh. Any comments, Ambassador Shaikh, with reference to what Ambassador Zamir Akram said?
Well, partly before that, I'd like to mention that we have with Iran the issues of the Ansarullah and the rapid reaction force that we've created to try and ensure that the border between our two countries is as safe as possible. We haven't quite reached the point where we can say that we do not have problems with people in Sistan, Balochistan, the Iranian province, making incursions into Pakistani Balochistan, and vice versa. These are issues that we have to address, and on which I think we've made a fair degree of progress with the rapid reaction force that we've created and the border wall that the Iranians are putting up, and in which we are putting up a part also. So we must keep that in mind also. We must also keep in mind that that particular border is one that the Iranians believe is susceptible to use by adversaries, and that therefore they need to have much closer cooperation with Pakistan on that particular regards. Now, with regard to what you asked on the visits to these three countries, look, if it happens that the Taliban do not turn up in Turkey, and that unfortunately seems to me to be likely.
Thank you so much. That was Ambassador Shaikh speaking with us. Before I wrap up, let's go back to Ambassador Masood. Ambassador Masood, any last thoughts with reference to the Taliban, with reference to the Pakistan-Iran thing, and specifically, if you could quickly touch upon the fact that we've had reports of the Iranian intelligence recruiting people from Pakistan, especially from Parachinar and some other areas, and getting them to Syria. They're also doing this with the Afghan Hazaras. So have we had any conversation, candid conversation with the Iranians on that?
Well, this is a fact, and this is something that has marred our relations, basically, because otherwise between Iran and Pakistan, there's no such issue that would sour our relations. But this is one issue, apart from the border, which is a very disturbing border, but the fact that we have reports of Iranian activities in Pakistan and Iranian recruiting people from Pakistan for their activities beyond their region. This is a difficult situation with us. We do raise it with the Iranians every now and then, but we don't really seem to get very far, because it's always a situation of there's no proof, and then we have problems with the Chabahar and activities of India taking place through Iran. So these issues are there, the border issues are there, the fact that we have reports of Iranians meddling in our internal affairs through recruiting such entities. But apart from that, we should also look at, as the Master Shaikh was pointing out, that the larger picture of this region, where peace can only come through economic cooperation and through a dialogue between our countries. And as I said earlier, and I would just like to repeat as we end, that the future of Irani-Pakistani relations is having a border trade, a robust border and trade between the two countries, despite the sanctions. We can find ways around the sanctions. And the other area where we can cooperate is, of course, Afghanistan, because Afghanistan is pivotal. The peace in that country is pivotal to both Iran and Pakistan and to our region. So those are the two areas where we should focus upon. And yes, the difficulties we have, we can overcome them.
Thank you. That was Ambassador Riffat Masood speaking with us. We shall take a short break and return to discuss Biden administration's policy of extricating from Afghanistan regardless of the outcome of the peace process. Stay with us. Welcome back to In Focus. Last Sunday, U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken defended the Biden administration's decision to withdraw from Afghanistan, saying the terror threat had moved elsewhere and Washington needed to refocus resources on challenges such as China and the pandemic. The administration has clearly indicated that it is pulling out regardless of the outcome of the intra-Afghan peace process, though it is trying through regional powers and the United Nations to get a breakthrough in talks. Taliban are not biting and have indicated they will not attend the Istanbul conference. Panic seems to be gripping civil society activists in Afghanistan, with posts on social media indicating that those who can afford to leave are planning to get out before the situation worsens. President Ashraf Ghani's government, for all the talk about sustaining itself once U.S. NATO troops leave, is unlikely to sustain the attrition Taliban can inflict on the Afghan National Security Forces. Pakistan is trying to get a regional consensus on pressuring the Taliban to return to the table in a meaningful way. Pakistan's foreign minister was in the UAE, reached Tehran earlier today, and is scheduled to go to Turkey. High on the agenda is Afghanistan, but the situation seems to be getting out of hand. To discuss this further, I am joined by Rahimulla, the resident editor of the News. Mr. Yusufzai, it's very clear that the Americans have decided, as Antony Blinken has said, as also be indicated by President Biden, that we are getting out no matter where the talks go or whether the talks succeed or not. So essentially, it seems that the Taliban will now bide their time. And once the Americans are gone, the Taliban are going to go for a military push against the Ghani government. Is that a sense that you also get?
A very categorical statement from President Biden and Secretary of State Antony Blinken. And, they say it's unconditional withdrawal. Although we remember that Mr. Biden was saying earlier that he would like to keep a small counter-terrorism force in Afghanistan, but now Antony Blinken is saying that terror has moved from Afghanistan elsewhere. So I don't know what prompted this change in thinking in Washington. But I think that, if you talk to other people, many Afghans and those who support the Afghan government, they will say that there's still a threat of terror originating from Afghanistan because there are more than 20 global terrorist groups which are based in Afghanistan. We have been hearing from the Afghan leadership, a number of them, they are saying that, the withdrawal will lead to a civil war. So I think that, there is no consensus on this issue. I think, Taliban, by not agreeing to attend the Istanbul conference, actually have, in a way decided that they will wait and see whether the foreign troops withdraw even by September 11th. I think they still don't trust the Americans. But I think that in a way, the unconditional withdrawal, because earlier it was condition-based. Trump's peace agreement with Taliban was condition-based. And Biden was saying the same thing. But now, if they say there are no conditions, I think this will go in favor of Taliban. And eventually the foreign troops will withdraw, even if there is a 4-month delay. So I think it is to their advantage. But I doubt that they will make a big push towards Kabul. I think they will try to consolidate their position in the rural areas, maybe try to capture some provincial capitals, but they will not launch a big military offensive. They will wait, I think.
Right. I mean, when I said they will go for a military push, the idea is that, they're already under, the control of about 50% of the country already, and they can keep leapfrogging and keep getting other areas before they make a final push for Kabul. But Rahimulla Yusufzai, you have been watching Afghanistan for more than 4 decades. Now, you recall that on 7 December 2001, Mullah Abdul Salam Zaif made a statement, and he said, tomorrow the Taliban will start surrendering their weapons. I think we should go home. Now, that was the time when the United States and the US allies could have actually created the conditions for a new Afghanistan by pulling in the Taliban and letting the Taliban go, but they did not do that. Do you think, with hindsight, that was a grave mistake by the Americans?
Lakhdar Brahimi, the UN Special Envoy, who actually, organized, along with Germany, the Bonn Conference, which led to the creation of a new government led by Hamid Karzai, even he conceded that it was a mistake. All those involved in the process, they have been saying somehow that Taliban should have been engaged. Taliban should have been allowed to surrender, whatever. I don't know if Mullah Zaif was speaking for all the Taliban leadership or for the movement when he said Taliban would start surrendering their weapons. I think there were many elements among Taliban who were not willing to surrender. They would not have joined that government after the collapse of Taliban government. I think, that would not have happened. But they would certainly have gone to their villages, returned to their homes, maybe started doing their other jobs, not as fighters, but say as farmers. But I think that, this should have been a lesson that, even now if you are trying to make peace, you have to involve all the stakeholders, all the combatant groups. If you keep out one group, that group will somehow get support from outside the country. They will be the proxies for some, some power. And that will create problems. So you have to try and involve and engage all these groups, because that will lead to a durable peace.
Right. Say Rahimulla Yusufzai. I'm also joined by Dr. Adam Weinstein, who served in Afghanistan as a Marine and is now a research fellow at Quincy Institute for Responsible Statecraft and in Washington, D.C. Dr. Weinstein, thank you for being on the program. You are the right person to talk about this because, there was a time when you actually served there, so you know the ground situation. So give me your sense, and now it's about unconditional withdrawal. As Anthony Blinken said, and President Biden has also been saying this. So as an insurgent force, which already has a deal with the United States and has front-loaded lots of conditions with reference to talking to Kabul, all the Taliban need do is wait. I don't think they have any incentive now to actually talk to the Kabul government.
First I should say I'm a lawyer by training, not a PhD, but I agree with you that the Taliban have little incentive, but they wouldn't have had incentive had the United States remained in Afghanistan, because that would have been an abrogation of the U.S.-Taliban agreement. And I think it's pretty clear that the Taliban would have just returned to targeting NATO troops as well, and the United States would have been drawn deeper into the conflict. Right.
Dr. Weinstein, let me quote from a book that one of the former British officers, Captain Emil Simpson, wrote. It's called War from the Ground Up. And there's a vignette in that. And it says in April 1975 in Hanoi, a week before the fall of Saigon, Colonel Harry Summers of the U.S. Army told his North Vietnamese counterpart, Colonel Tu, "You never beat us on the battlefield," to which Tu replied, "That may be so, but it is also irrelevant." Now, I find this very interesting as a, personally a student of warfare, that the regular militaries still haven't really gotten the idea of how effective they can be in irregular war, if at all they can be effective, whether it is purely a military campaign, whether it's essentially a political administrative approach. Give me your sense, based on your experience as a Marine in Afghanistan, of what was it that the U.S. military and its allies did wrong?
I think counterinsurgency is difficult for any military. The French experienced it in Algeria. The Americans experienced it in Afghanistan. And there's numerous other examples. And even the Pakistani military has experienced it. What the United States did wrong in Afghanistan from a coin perspective was it sought to influence a civil war, essentially. And the trouble with counterinsurgency is that for the insurgency to win, all they have to essentially do is keep fighting, and the Taliban have incredible resolve to do that. For the counterinsurgency to win, it had, militarily at least, there has to be a complete military defeat of the insurgency, and this is why counterinsurgencies drag on for decades.
Right. General McMaster also talked about what he called the zero dark 30 syndrome or fallacy. The use of special operation forces, night raids. United States military has the most advanced real-time intelligence and information networks, and yet it did not really work out. Is that something you would agree with, what McMaster's called the zero dark 30 fallacy?
I don't know the context in which he said it, but I agree that perhaps an over-reliance on, where I agree is that special operations is not magic. I mean, neither are drones. It doesn't necessarily replace human intelligence or having troops on the ground, although I would also point out that many of H.R. McMaster's comments about Afghanistan, with all due respect to his position, are reminiscent of what a colonial viceroy might have said 100 years ago. And I think what he envisions for Afghanistan would be for the United States to remain there forever.
Well, that was an interesting comment. Thank you so much. That was Dr. Adam Weinstein speaking with us. Before I wrap up, let me go back to Rahimulla Yusufzai. Rahimulla Yusufzai, so if the Taliban don't go to the Istanbul conference, basically that conference means nothing. Give me your prognosis of what do you think is likely to happen in the coming 1 to 2 months?
I think Taliban are still, holding consultations. They have said they will not attend, but I think it is still possible that they will be persuaded to attend. Because if they were holding talks in Doha since September, not only with the Afghan government, but also with other Afghan politicians and parties, I think they will eventually decide that, we have to go there, we must say what we want to say, and we still have taken a position. But in a way, the Americans are leaving because, if you look at it, earlier withdrawal by Trump, as decided in Doha, was condition-based. This withdrawal by Biden is unconditional, so it goes in favor of Taliban. And, you are trying to make a point that as long as there are foreign forces, we will not attend any peace conference because that is not, useful anymore. But I think, maybe Qatar and Pakistan and maybe China, Russia, even the US, they are still trying, and they will persuade Taliban to attend because, Taliban get an opportunity to express their views, reiterate what they are saying now, the presence of foreign forces, the violation of the agreement. And also, I think that, they will not like to annoy all these countries which have been in close contact with Taliban. And also, Taliban would not like to be seen as anti-peace. So I'm still really hopeful that Taliban would eventually attend. Maybe the conference will be delayed again, but they will eventually go there. And it will not lead to any breakthrough, as far as I am concerned. But at least, they will be there, because without Taliban, the conference will have no value.
Absolutely. And let that the concerned countries can actually manage to influence the Taliban or pressure them, if you will, into attending. Thank you so much. That was Rahimulla Yusufzai speaking with us. This is all from In Focus this evening. We shall see you tomorrow at the same time. Keep following our latest updates on social media at indus.news. And given the third COVID-19 wave, both in Pakistan and across the world, stay safe and follow the non-vaccine safety protocols. Good night and goodbye.